A mafia boss spent millions trying to save his son, but in the end, it was a cleaning lady in yellow rubber gloves who brought the boy back to life, and what he did for her shocked the entire underworld. Maxwell Thornton killed the engine of his black armored Maybach in front of the imposing facade of his Chicago mansion. The roar of the engine died instantly, but the noise inside his head never stopped. He sat there for a moment with both hands gripping the leather steering wheel, breathing deeply, trying to delay a few more seconds before stepping into the house that for 2 years had felt more like a cold marble mausoleum than a home. He loosened the collar of his black shirt, still carrying the faint smell of gunpowder from the night's work, and stepped out of the car. His footsteps echoed lonely on the stone driveway. He was the man who had everything. A criminal empire that controlled half of Chicago, the fear of every rival family, and a bank account that could buy anything. But every time he crossed that massive iron gate, he felt like the poorest man on earth, because inside that fortress, his 3-year-old son Ethan had not spoken a single word since watching his mother get shot to death right before his eyes 2 years ago, and no amount of money could buy back the voice of a broken child. If this story touches your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. Because sometimes the greatest miracles come from the hands wearing yellow rubber gloves. Maxwell pushed open the heavy iron door and stepped into the main hall of the mansion. The crystal chandelier blazed overhead, yet it couldn't drive away the cold atmosphere that clung to the place. Raymond Collins, his loyal right hand, was already waiting in a perfectly tailored black suit, as he did every night. The 50-year-old man's face showed no emotion, but Maxwell could read the exhaustion in his eyes. "Sir, everything is the same," Raymond said in a low, even voice. The boy didn't eat dinner. He only managed a few sips of milk, and then sat by the window until he fell asleep. "The nurse says his heart rate is stable, but his weight keeps dropping." Maxwell didn't reply. He had heard reports like this hundreds of times over the past 2 years, and every time they landed in his ears, it felt like someone was carving into his chest with a dull knife. He climbed the staircase, each step heavy as if his legs were wrapped in lead, passing expensive oil paintings on the walls without sparing them a glance. When he reached the door of the master bedroom, he stopped. That room had been sealed shut for 2 years, ever since that fateful night, the night everything in Maxwell's life collapsed completely. He closed his eyes and the memories surged back like an unstoppable flood. That night was cold too, just like tonight. Melissa, his wife, was stepping out of the car in front of the house with Ethan in her arms. She was wearing her favorite red dress, her golden hair lifted by the wind, her smile radiant as she looked at her son babbling his first attempts at calling for his mother. Maxwell followed behind, carrying a bag of gifts for Ethan's first birthday. He remembered thinking about when he would teach his son to ride a bike someday. Then the gunshots rang out. 1 shot, 2 shots, 3 shots. Everything happened so fast that Maxwell didn't have time to react. Melissa collapsed, her blood soaking into the red fabric of her dress, staining the ground, staining the small face of Ethan lying in his mother's arms. The black car of the assassins vanished into the night. Maxwell screamed like a wounded animal, holding his dying wife as Ethan sat beside them, his eyes wide open, watching his mother fade away. From that night on, the boy never opened his mouth to speak another word. Anthony Ricci, the boss of the rival Mafia family, had ordered Melissa's assassination in revenge for Maxwell taking control of the southern part of the city. He wanted Maxwell to suffer, and he succeeded. Maxwell took his revenge. He killed 12 of Ricci's men within a month, burned down 3 casinos and 2 warehouses, yet Ricci himself continued to hide like a rat. And no matter how many people Maxwell killed, he couldn't bring Melissa back, couldn't make Ethan call him father even one more time. He had done everything he could. A top psychologist from Vienna was brought in for a fee of $200,000 for 2 weeks of treatment. The man tried every method from play therapy to hypnosis. But Ethan sat there like a statue, his empty eyes staring through everything. A neurology specialist from Johns Hopkins flew to Chicago with a private nursing team and equipment worth millions. They scanned his brain, ran blood tests, measured brain waves, then shook their heads and said the boy's brain was perfectly normal. The problem was psychological, not physical. A private clinic in Switzerland took Ethan in for 3 weeks at a cost of $500,000. They used equine therapy, art therapy, even experimental drugs that hadn't been approved. Ethan came back worse than before, terrified of anyone in a white coat, screaming whenever he saw a needle. Maxwell even hired a team of artificial intelligence robots from Japan, designed specifically to interact with children with autism and psychological trauma. Ethan hurled the robot into the wall within the first 10 minutes of the very first session. In total, Maxwell had spent more than $3 million over 2 years. $3 million, and not a single result. The last doctor he saw, a leading professor from Harvard, looked him straight in the eye and told him to prepare himself. The boy might never speak again. He had built a wall around his soul, and no one could break it. Maxwell remembered pulling out his gun and aiming it at the professor's head. Raymond had to intervene before he pulled the trigger. Now, standing outside his son's room, Maxwell felt that familiar helplessness rising again, choking his throat. He was the most powerful man in Chicago, a man who could make anyone kneel with a single phone call. Yet he couldn't make his own son speak a single word to call him father. Victoria Sterling appeared at the far end of the hallway just as Maxwell was standing outside Ethan's door. The sound of her high heels struck a steady rhythm against the oak floor, not fast enough to seem rushed, not slow enough to be judged lazy. Everything about Victoria was calculated down to the smallest detail. She approached Maxwell with a graceful stride, her dark brown hair pulled into a flawless bun without a single strand out of place. A perfectly tailored black suit hugging the slender frame of the 45-year-old woman. "Mr. Thornton, I've arranged the schedule for next week," Victoria said in a warm, measured voice meant only for him. "Dr. Peterson will come on Tuesday for the boys' routine checkup. Thursday there's a meeting with the attorneys regarding the Northern real estate lawsuit, and I've canceled the charity gala this weekend because I thought you needed rest." Maxwell nodded without speaking, his eyes still fixed on his son's door. Victoria stood beside him, close enough to show concern but far enough to maintain professional distance. She had worked for the Thornton family for 5 years, since Melissa was still alive, and she remembered clearly the first day she stepped into this mansion. Back then, Victoria was only an ordinary house manager hired to oversee domestic affairs, but from the very first moment she saw Maxwell Thornton, she knew she wanted more. He was the embodiment of power, wealth, and danger, everything that intoxicated her. Melissa was the only obstacle in her path. A young, pretty wife, with golden hair and an innocent smile, completely unworthy of standing beside a man like Maxwell. Victoria had waited patiently, observing in silence, memorizing all of Maxwell's habits, knowing he liked black coffee with no sugar in the morning, liked reading financial news before breakfast, hated the scent of roses but loved jasmine. She made herself indispensable in this house, controlling everything from the master's schedule to the dinner menu, from staff recruitment to household finances. When Melissa died, Victoria had to struggle not to smile. She played the role of the grieving house manager perfectly, wearing black for 3 months, lighting memorial candles every week, even crying in front of Maxwell a few times to show sympathy. But deep down, she knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Melissa was gone, and Victoria would slowly take her place. Over the past 5 years, Victoria had steadily expanded her power within the house. She dismissed the old servants who had been loyal to Melissa and replaced them with people she personally selected. She controlled who was allowed inside, who was allowed to see the master. Even the doctors and specialists treating Ethan had to go through her first. Victoria saw herself as the true mistress of the Thornton mansion, lacking only a wedding ring to legitimize her position. She watched Maxwell standing like a statue outside his son's door and felt a flicker of irritation. He cared far too much about that mute child. If it were Victoria, she would have sent Ethan to a mental institution long ago and started a new life. But she knew she couldn't say that out loud, at least not yet. "You need to rest," Victoria said gently, reaching out to touch Maxwell's arm. "I've prepared a hot bath and red wine in your room. Let me take care of everything here." Maxwell withdrew his arm from her reach, the movement gentle but firm enough for her to understand the boundary. "I'll check on Ethan first," he said, pushing the door open and stepping into his son's room, leaving Victoria standing alone in the hallway as the smile slowly faded from her lips. She watched Maxwell's back and clenched her hands tightly. Patience, Victoria told herself. She had waited 5 years. She could wait a few more. Sooner or later, Maxwell would realize that Victoria was the woman who truly deserved to stand beside him, not a dead wife or a mute child. Sooner or later, the position of mistress of the Thornton mansion would belong to her. More than 20 miles south of the Thornton mansion, in the most run-down part of Chicago where even the police hesitate to go after dark, Charlotte Hayes was kneeling on the floor, wiping away the blood her mother had just coughed up. Their cheap apartment sat on the 5th floor of a decaying building, its stairwell reeking of urine and its walls shedding paint in brittle flakes. Tonight the Chicago cold cut straight to the bone, But the heater had been broken since last month, and Charlotte didn't have the money to fix it. All she could do was pile extra blankets on her mother and pray that she would survive the night. Dorothy Hayes lay on the worn-out bed, her body so gaunt that each rib could be counted beneath her wrinkled skin. She was only 58 years old, yet she looked closer to 70 as lung cancer gnawed at her body day by day. The doctor said she had about 6 months left without surgery, but the operation cost $500,000, a number Charlotte couldn't even dream of, not even if she worked her entire life. "Mom, take your medicine," Charlotte said softly as she lifted her mother's head and pressed the pain pill to her lips. Dorothy opened her eyes and looked at her daughter with an expression heavy with guilt. "My child, I'm sorry," she whispered in a rough, broken voice. "I dragged you down with me. You should have been in school. You should have had a better life than this." Charlotte squeezed her mother's hand and fought back tears. She was 27 years old. She should have been in her final year at a teacher's college. She should have been preparing for a bright future in the profession she had always dreamed of. But life didn't give her that chance. She had been forced to drop out 3 years earlier when her mother fell ill, and since then she had taken every job she could find, washing dishes in restaurants, cleaning offices, serving drinks in bars, doing laundry for strangers. Now she worked 3 jobs a day, cleaning for a janitorial company in the morning, waiting tables at a diner in the afternoon, washing dishes at an Italian restaurant at night. Altogether, she earned about $2,000 a month, with $1,500 going toward rent and her mother's medication, leaving $500 for food and basic living expenses. Their medical debt had already climbed to $200,000 and kept swelling like a balloon about to burst. Charlotte knew that even if she worked herself to death, she'd never pay it all off, but she had no other choice. She looked down at her own hands, rough and cracked from constant exposure to cleaning chemicals, and suddenly remembered her stepfather's hands years ago, those large, hairy hands that had beaten her throughout 8 years of childhood. Her mother remarried when Charlotte was 10, 1 year after her biological father died in a workplace accident. The man her mother married, Frank, was a violent alcoholic who beat his wife and her daughter as if it were routine. Charlotte remembered hiding in the closet at night, covering her ears so she wouldn't hear his shouting, going to school in the mornings with bruises hidden under long sleeves, being taken to the hospital with broken ribs or dislocated arms while her mother lied and said the girl had fallen down the stairs. The long scar on Charlotte's back was a reminder of the night he lashed her with a leather belt until her skin split open because she had broken his beer glass. She was 14 then. The stepfather left when Charlotte was 18, after draining her mother's meager savings and leaving behind a mountain of debt. But the scars on Charlotte's body and in her soul never faded. She was afraid of men, afraid of shouting, afraid of the dark, and more than anything, she understood the pain of wounded children better than anyone. That was why she had dreamed of becoming a teacher, so she could help children like the one she once was. But that dream now felt as distant as the stars in the Chicago night sky. Charlotte stood when she saw her mother had fallen asleep. She walked to the window and looked down at the dark street below, where a few addicts huddled in corners and the wail of a police siren echoed somewhere far away. Tomorrow she would go to an interview for a new job, a janitorial position at a mansion in the wealthy northern suburbs of the city. The pay was 3 times higher than usual, but it required living on site and obeying strict rules. Charlotte didn't know who owned the mansion, and she didn't care. She only knew that she needed money, a lot of money, to save her mother, and she was willing to do whatever it took to get it. "God, please help me," Charlotte whispered into the darkness before pulling the thin blanket over her shoulders and sitting down in the chair beside her mother's bed, preparing herself for a long, sleepless night. Charlotte stood before the massive iron gates of the Thornton mansion and felt her heart pounding hard against her ribs. She had taken 3 buses and spent nearly 2 hours getting here from the south side. The mansion in front of her was larger than anything she had ever seen in her life, with white marble columns, a gleaming black-tiled roof, and vast gardens trimmed to perfection. Charlotte drew in a deep breath and pressed the buzzer. The gates slowly opened, and she stepped inside carrying an old backpack that held a few changes of clothes and a photograph of her mother. A man in a black suit greeted her at the main entrance and led her through the grand hall, where crystal chandeliers sparkled, along long corridors lined with expensive oil paintings, and into a small room at the back of the mansion. Victoria Sterling was already waiting there with a file in her hands, her sharp eyes sweeping over Charlotte from head to toe. "You are Charlotte Hayes," Victoria said in a flat, emotionless voice as she read from the file. 27 years old, no college degree, no experience working for elite households, living in the South Side. Charlotte nodded and struggled to keep her voice from shaking. Yes, ma'am. I've worked in cleaning for 3 years. I can do any job you assign me. Victoria set the file down and stood, circling Charlotte like a hawk studying its prey. Listen carefully, girl. In this house, we have very strict rules, and if you break even one of them, you'll be dismissed immediately without being paid a single dollar. First, you're not allowed to ask anything about the master or his work. Second, you're not allowed to look directly into the master's eyes when he speaks to you. Third, you're not allowed to speak to the master unless he addresses you first. Fourth, you're not allowed to set foot on the second floor where the master's bedroom and the young master's room are, unless you receive a direct order from me. Fifth, you're not allowed to disclose anything you see or hear in this house to anyone outside. Do you understand? Charlotte swallowed and nodded. Yes, ma'am. I understand. Victoria opened a cabinet and took out a light blue uniform and a pair of bright yellow rubber gloves. This is your uniform, Victoria said, tossing the clothes into Charlotte's arms. You'll wear it every day from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. You must wear these gloves whenever you work because the master hates seeing servants' hands touching his belongings. Your room is in the basement, at the end of the corridor on the left. Your monthly salary is $6,000, paid at the end of each month. If you do well, there may be bonuses. If you don't, you already know the way back to the gate. Charlotte hugged the uniform and the yellow gloves to her chest as if they were treasures. $6,000 a month, 3 times what she earned from all 3 of her jobs combined. With that money, she could slowly pay down the hospital debt and might even save toward her mother's surgery. Thank you, Charlotte said with deep gratitude. I promise I won't disappoint you. Victoria looked at her coldly. Don't thank me yet, she said. Many people have come here and left in less than a week because they couldn't handle the pressure. Our master is a very demanding man, and this house holds more secrets than you think. I hope you're smart enough to know what to look at and what to close your eyes to. Charlotte lowered her head and said nothing more. She didn't care who the master was or what secrets the house held. She only needed to work, earn money, and save her mother. That was all that mattered to her right now. Victoria led Charlotte down to the basement and showed her a tiny room with a single bed, an old wooden wardrobe, and a dim yellow light bulb. The room had no windows and felt damp, but it was still far better than the slum apartment on the south side. Charlotte set her backpack on the bed and looked at the yellow rubber gloves in her hands. She didn't know that these gloves would change her life forever. She also didn't know that on the second floor of this mansion, a 3-year-old boy was curled up in the corner of a dark room, waiting for a miracle that no one believed would ever come. A week had passed since Charlotte began working at the Thornton mansion. She had gradually adjusted to the harsh rhythm of life here, waking at 5 in the morning to prepare her supplies, starting cleaning at 6, and ending her work at 10 at night. The yellow rubber gloves had become part of her body, worn from morning until night until she'd almost forgotten the feeling of bare skin touching anything at all. Charlotte worked hard and in silence. She followed every rule Victoria set, asking nothing, looking at nothing, speaking to no one unless absolutely necessary. She had seen the master, Maxwell Thornton, a few times from a distance, a tall man with eyes cold as ice and a stride filled with authority, but she'd never come closer than 3 meters. That night, while Charlotte was cleaning the first-floor hallway, she heard a strange sound drifting down from the staircase. She stopped and listened. It was crying, not loud crying, but a choked, stifled sob, as if someone were forcing pain down in their throat. Charlotte knew she wasn't allowed on the second floor, but her legs seemed to have a will of their own, carrying her step by step up the stairs toward the sound. The second-floor hallway was dim, lit only by a few yellow wall lamps. Charlotte walked along the corridor, the crying growing clearer, until she stopped before a slightly open door at the very end. She knew this was the young master's room, the room Victoria had strictly forbidden her to approach. But that crying, that raw and desperate crying, wouldn't let her turn away. Charlotte peered through the crack in the door and felt her heart squeeze tight. The vast room was filled with expensive toys, from remote-controlled cars to intelligent robots, from giant teddy bears to Lego sets, all lying untouched. And in the farthest corner, beneath a large window overlooking the garden, a little boy sat curled up hugging his knees. He had pale blonde hair and bluish-white skin, large round eyes that looked hollow like bottomless pits, and he was crying without making a sound. Tears streamed down his cheeks, his lips pressed tight, his small body trembling while not a single sound escaped. Charlotte felt her knees give way. She knew that look. She knew that curled posture. She knew the feeling of crying without daring to cry out loud. That was her, 20 years ago, sitting in a closet corner after her stepfather beat her, clutching her knees and praying for the pain to pass. Little Charlotte back then and little Ethan now, two children from different worlds yet sharing the same pain. The pain of souls wounded so deeply they couldn't even open their mouths to call for help. Charlotte wanted to run in and hold the boy, wanted to tell him she understood, that she understood everything. But she knew she couldn't. She was only a janitor. She had no right to touch the young master. She'd be fired immediately if anyone found her standing there. But just as Charlotte turned to leave, Ethan suddenly lifted his head, his eyes locking onto the crack in the door where she stood. For a moment, their gazes met. The eyes of a 27-year-old woman who had survived hell, and the eyes of a 3-year-old boy trapped in a hell of his own. Charlotte didn't know if the boy truly saw her, but she swore she'd find a way to help him, one way or another, even if it cost her job, because no one deserved to endure loneliness like that, least of all a child. In the days that followed that night, Charlotte quietly began approaching Ethan in her own way. Whenever she cleaned the first-floor hallway near the staircase, she would hum softly the lullabies her mother used to sing to her. She didn't sing loudly, only enough for the sound to drift up to the second floor, enough for some small pair of ears to hear. Then one day, as Charlotte was wiping down the stairs, she saw a small figure standing at the top, looking down. Ethan stood there, clutching a teddy bear to his chest, his wide eyes fixed on her without blinking. Charlotte didn't move closer. She simply smiled and kept singing, kept cleaning as if nothing unusual were happening. The next day, Ethan stood one step closer. The day after that, he sat on the top stair, and so it went, day by day, the distance between them shrinking until Ethan was sitting just a few steps away, listening to her sing and watching her work. Charlotte told him stories about a white rabbit that could fly, about a teddy bear with magic powers that could heal any wound, about a game of doctor she used to play alone as a child to forget the beatings. Ethan didn't speak, but his eyes were no longer empty as before. A small spark of light was slowly beginning to glow within them. That afternoon, while Charlotte was cleaning the master bedroom, a task she was rarely assigned, she heard the sound of tiny footsteps running along the hallway. She turned and saw Ethan standing in the doorway, holding a red plastic toy stethoscope in his hand. The boy looked at her with a pleading expression, then pointed at the large bed and made a motion for her to lie down. Charlotte understood immediately what he wanted. He wanted to play doctor, the game she had spoken about in her stories. Her heart raced because she knew this was a serious violation. Lying on the master's bed was an unforgivable offense. But when she looked into Ethan's eyes that held life for the first time after 2 years of silence, she couldn't refuse. Charlotte lay down on the enormous bed covered in pristine white sheets, still wearing her pale blue uniform and the yellow rubber gloves streaked with soap suds. She closed her eyes and pretended to sleep, letting Ethan explore his game freely. The boy stepped up to the bed with the seriousness of a real doctor, placed the toy stethoscope against Charlotte's back, and began to move it slowly. Charlotte whispered in a weak voice, "Dr. Ethan, is my heart healthy? Is it sad or happy today?" She didn't expect an answer. She only wanted to create a safe space where the boy could be himself. Neither of them knew that Maxwell Thornton had come home earlier than usual. He had just finished a tense meeting with his partners and wanted to rest. As he climbed the stairs to the second floor, he noticed the door to his bedroom slightly open and instinctively reached behind his back to grip the gun hidden beneath his jacket. He moved toward the doorway, his heart pounding, prepared for the worst. But what he saw made him freeze in place. On his $1 million bed, a young woman in a janitor's uniform lay face down, bright yellow rubber gloves resting against the immaculate white sheets in a contrast so stark it felt unreal. And beside her, his son Ethan, the child who had allowed no one to touch him for 2 years, was playing doctor with an expression so serious it was almost endearing. The boy moved the toy stethoscope along her back, then did something Maxwell hadn't seen in 2 years. Ethan gently patted her shoulder and nodded, as if announcing the result of an examination. "All better," the boy whispered, his voice rough from long disuse but clear enough for Maxwell to hear every word. "All better." Maxwell felt his legs give way and had to grab the doorframe to keep from falling. His son had just spoken. After 2 years of silence, after millions of dollars spent on the world's top specialists, his son had opened his mouth and spoken to a janitor wearing yellow gloves. At that moment, Ethan lifted his head and saw his father standing in the doorway. The boy's eyes were no longer filled with fear as before. Instead, there was a warmth Maxwell had thought was lost forever. "Papa," Ethan called, his voice trembling but proud. "She was sick. I fixed her." Maxwell Thornton, the Mafia boss who made all of Chicago tremble, The man who had never shed a tear in front of anyone broke down and cried like a child right there at the threshold of his own bedroom. Charlotte heard the choked sobbing and jolted upright from the bed as if struck by electricity. When she saw Maxwell Thornton standing in the doorway with his face soaked in tears, the blood in her veins seemed to freeze solid. "I'm dead," she thought. "I lay on the master's bed. I broke the most serious rule. I'll be fired, or worse." In this world, she'd heard whispers that her employer wasn't an ordinary man. Charlotte scrambled off the bed and collapsed to her knees at Maxwell's feet. Her head bowed so low it nearly touched the floor, her whole body shaking beyond control. "Please forgive me," she said through broken sobs. "I'm sorry. I know I was wrong. I shouldn't have been here. I shouldn't have touched your bed. Please don't fire me. I need this job. My mother is very sick. Please, sir." Charlotte's tears splashed onto the icy marble floor. She didn't dare lift her head to look at her employer, afraid she'd see rage burning in those cold eyes. She waited for shouting. She waited for the order to throw her out. She waited for whatever punishment was coming. Instead, she heard a rough, hoarse voice above her. "Stand up." Charlotte didn't move. "I said stand up," Maxwell repeated, his voice not angry as she'd expected, but filled with something she couldn't name. Charlotte slowly rose on trembling legs, still not daring to meet his gaze. She felt Maxwell's large hand take hold of her chin and lift it, forcing her to face him. His eyes were red from crying, but there was no fury in them, only shock and something that looked painfully like hope. "What did you do to my son?" Maxwell asked, his voice shaking. "For 2 years he didn't speak a single word. I spent millions of dollars on the best specialists in the world and no one could do it. And you, a janitor, what did you do?" Charlotte swallowed hard, her heart hammering wildly in her chest. She didn't know how to explain it because she didn't fully understand it herself. I just sang to him," Charlotte began, her words stumbling. "Last week I accidentally heard him crying in his room. I saw him curled up alone in the corner and I remembered myself when I was little. I was a child like that too, sitting alone in the dark, scared and lonely, no one understanding, no one listening. I knew I wasn't allowed to go near him, but I couldn't ignore it. I started singing while I cleaned the stairs. Lullabies my mother used to sing to me. I didn't go close to him. I just sang and waited. Then he came closer on his own, little by little, one step each day." Charlotte paused to catch her breath. Her gloved hands clenched tightly together. "I told him stories," she continued. "Stories about stuffed animals that could talk. About the doctor game I used to play alone when I was little to forget the beatings. He didn't say anything, but he listened. I saw his eyes change. I saw him begin to trust me. And today he came into this room while I was cleaning. He had the toy stethoscope and wanted to play doctor. I knew I shouldn't lie on your bed, but I couldn't refuse him. I couldn't refuse those eyes. I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry." Maxwell released Charlotte's chin and stepped back. He turned to look at Ethan, who was still standing by the bed clutching the toy stethoscope, his eyes fixed on his father with anxious fear, as if worried his father would hurt the kind woman. The Mafia boss felt his chest tear open. For years, he'd tried to use money to solve everything. He believed dollars could buy anything, from life to power, from loyalty to fear. But it turned out what his son needed wasn't expensive doctors or advanced machines. It was a heart that could understand, someone who'd endured similar pain and knew how to heal without force. Maxwell turned back to Charlotte. She stood there in her yellow rubber gloves smeared with soap suds, her uniform wrinkled from the bed, her hair loose and tangled, her eyes red from crying. She wasn't delicately beautiful like Melissa. She wasn't elegant and refined like Victoria. She was just an ordinary girl from the South Side slums, with calloused hands and a past full of scars. Yet she'd done what his entire empire couldn't. "What's your name?" Maxwell asked. "Charlotte, sir. Charlotte Hayes." Maxwell nodded and said words Charlotte couldn't believe she was hearing. "Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you for bringing my son back to me." That night, Maxwell couldn't sleep. He sat alone in his private study, the glass of whiskey in his hand long since gone cold without him taking a single sip. The image of Ethan calling out Papa replayed in his mind like a film that refused to shut off. He picked up the phone and called Raymond. His voice was low and decisive as always, even though it was nearly 3 in the morning. "I need everything on Charlotte Hayes, the new janitor. Everything. From her date of birth to her family background, from her education to her finances. I want the report on my desk before 8 in the morning. Raymond didn't ask why, because he knew his employer never did anything without purpose. The next morning at 7:45 sharp, Raymond stood at the door of Maxwell's office with a thick file in his hands. Maxwell motioned for him to sit and began reading page by page. The more he read, the darker his eyes became, his hand tightening around the papers until the corners crumpled. Charlotte Hayes, born March 12th, 27 years old. Biological father Thomas Hayes, steel factory worker, died in a workplace accident when Charlotte was 10. Mother Dorothy Hayes remarried 1 year later to Frank Morrison, an unemployed alcoholic with a record of domestic violence. Hospital records showed Charlotte was admitted 3 times between the ages of 11 and 14, first for broken ribs, second for a dislocated arm, third for a head injury. All were reported as household accidents, but attending physicians had noted suspected domestic abuse. Maxwell turned the next page and saw photographs from the medical file. Bruises covering a little girl's body, long scars across her back like marks left by a whip. Rage surged in his chest, his fist clenching until his nails dug into his skin. He was a man who had killed without hesitation, who had ordered the execution of dozens of enemies without a shred of regret. Yet seeing these images made him want to find Frank Morrison and put a bullet through his head. "Where is the stepfather now?" Maxwell asked Raymond in an icy voice. "Gone 9 years ago, sir," Raymond replied. "He drained Dorothy's savings and left behind a mountain of debt. His current whereabouts are unknown. He may have died from alcoholism or be drifting somewhere on the streets." Maxwell nodded and continued reading. Charlotte graduated high school with excellent grades and was accepted into Illinois Teachers College with a partial scholarship. She studied until her 3rd year, then was forced to drop out when her mother was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. Since then, she had held 17 different jobs, from washing dishes to bartending, from doing laundry for others to janitorial work. Her average monthly income was about $2,000, while rent and medication costs for her mother totaled $1,500. Her current medical debt stood at $213,000 and increased each month. Dorothy Hayes was diagnosed with an estimated 6 months to live without surgery, with the procedure costing approximately $500,000. Maxwell closed the file and sat in silence for a long time. This young woman's life was a long chain of pain and misfortune that even he, a man who had seen every dark corner of the underworld, found staggering. She'd survived hell without losing her compassion. She could still see the pain in the eyes of a stranger's child and give her time to heal it. He stood and headed for the door. "Call her up to my office," he ordered Raymond. Half an hour later, Charlotte stood outside Maxwell's office with her heart pounding. She hadn't slept all night, consumed by fear over what her employer would do after what had happened the day before. Victoria had looked at her with open hatred while leading her here, and Charlotte knew the house manager was waiting for her to be dismissed. Charlotte stepped inside and stood still like a defendant awaiting judgment. Maxwell sat behind the massive oak desk, his sharp eyes studying her without blinking. He gestured for her to sit in the chair opposite him, and Charlotte obeyed, though her legs trembled so badly she nearly fell. "I've looked into you," Maxwell said bluntly. "I know about your father, your stepfather, and everything you went through. I also know about your mother and the hospital debt." Charlotte felt her face burn with shame and anger. She didn't like someone invading her painful past like this, but she had no right to protest. She was only a janitor, and he was the master, a man who could crush her life with a single phone call. "I have a proposal for you," Maxwell continued. "I want you to become Ethan's primary caregiver, not a janitor, not a servant, a caregiver. A monthly salary of $20,000, more than 3 times what you earn now. In addition, I'll pay off your mother's entire medical debt and cover the cost of her surgery. She'll be transferred to the best hospital in Chicago and treated by the finest doctors." Charlotte thought she'd misheard. She sat there staring at Maxwell with her mouth open, as if he'd just spoken a foreign language. "Why?" she asked, the only question in her mind slipping out. "Why are you doing all this for me?" Maxwell looked straight into her eyes, and for the first time she saw something soft in those cold depths. "Because you did what my millions couldn't do," he said. "You brought my son back from the dead. To me, that's priceless." Victoria Sterling stood behind the velvet curtain in the hallway, witnessing the entire conversation between Maxwell and Charlotte through the slightly open door of the study. She couldn't hear every word clearly, but she saw enough to understand what was happening. She saw Maxwell look at Charlotte with an expression he hadn't given anyone since Melissa died. She saw the way he leaned forward when speaking to the girl, as if every word Charlotte said mattered. She saw Charlotte leave the room with tears on her face, but they were tears of happiness, not fear. and she knew that the position she had carefully built for herself over 5 long years was now under serious threat. The next day, news of Charlotte's promotion from janitor to Ethan's caregiver spread through the mansion like wildfire. Victoria had to grit her teeth and announce it to the staff on Maxwell's orders, and every word she spoke felt like swallowing poison. Who does that girl think she is? Victoria thought, as she watched Charlotte move her belongings from the basement room to a luxurious bedroom right next to Ethan's on the 2nd floor. A girl from the South Side slums, with no education, no background, no elegance, suddenly treated like an honored guest just because she made the mute child speak a few words. Victoria didn't believe in miracles. She believed Charlotte was playing a dirty game, maybe seducing the master, maybe using the child to climb higher. Whatever it was, Victoria swore she'd expose the girl's true face and drive her out of this house. She began her campaign quietly and with calculation. She summoned each servant privately into her room and planted seeds of suspicion in their minds. "Do you know where that girl Charlotte comes from?" Victoria whispered to the cook. "She's from the South Side, Chicago's crime and drug district. Who knows what kind of record she might have? Who knows what she's plotting in this house?" To the gardener, Victoria said she'd heard rumors Charlotte once worked in bars entertaining men for money. To the maids, she suggested Charlotte was deliberately trying to seduce the master to become the new lady of the mansion. The rumors spread like a virus, and before long Charlotte began to feel the shift in everyone's attitude. People who once smiled at her now turned away when she passed. Those who had spoken kindly now fell silent and looked at her with contempt. Her meals in the kitchen were always left cold or missing dishes. Her laundry was returned late or wrinkled. Charlotte didn't understand what was happening. She thought she might have unknowingly done something wrong, but whenever she asked, no one answered. From a distance, Victoria watched and smiled in triumph. She knew isolation would slowly erode Charlotte's spirit, would make the girl feel unwelcome, and eventually leave on her own. But what angered Victoria most was that despite the mistreatment, Charlotte didn't give up. The girl still woke early every day, still cared for Ethan with devotion, still smiled gently at the boy as if nothing were wrong. And Ethan, the child Victoria had tried for 2 years to get close to without success, now clung to Charlotte like a shadow. He talked to her, laughed with her, even allowed her to hold him, things he'd never done with anyone else in the house, including Victoria. That poured fuel onto the fire of jealousy burning inside her. Victoria realized rumors and isolation weren't enough to drive Charlotte away. She needed something stronger, a decisive blow that could destroy the girl completely. And when Victoria's gaze fell on the gold-plated Rolex watch on the vanity in the master bedroom, the watch Melissa had given Maxwell on their wedding day, a dark idea began to take shape in her mind. The weeks that followed became the most miraculous time the Thornton mansion had known since Melissa passed away. Ethan was like a withered flower finally given water, and day by day he opened new petals that left everyone who witnessed it in quiet awe. From a silent child who only knew how to curl up in the corner of a dark room, Ethan now ran through the house, his clear laughter echoing down hallways that had once felt as cold as a mausoleum. He began to speak more each day, from single words to short phrases, then to endless questions, just like any other normal 3-year-old. "Charlotte, why is the sky blue? Charlotte, what is that bird called? Charlotte, when can we play doctor again?" Every question Ethan asked was a priceless gift to those who had endured his terrifying silence for 2 long years. Charlotte spent almost all of her time beside Ethan. She read to him before bed, taught him to draw silly shapes with colored pencils, took him into the garden to show him the names of flowers and butterflies drifting past. She never forced him to do anything, never raised her voice when he was mischievous, never let him feel abandoned even for a single moment. And Ethan returned that love with absolute devotion. He followed Charlotte like a shadow, held her hand wherever they went, and called her name hundreds of times a day, as if afraid she might disappear if he didn't. Maxwell watched all of it from a distance. He didn't speak much, didn't interfere with how Charlotte cared for Ethan. He simply stood somewhere quiet and observed. He watched his son laugh when Charlotte told a joke. He watched the boy proudly show off his messy drawings. He watched Ethan fall asleep in Charlotte's arms after a long day of play. And every time he watched, he felt something strange stir in his chest, an emotion he thought had died with Melissa 2 years earlier. One afternoon, Maxwell came home earlier than usual and heard laughter coming from the back garden. He stepped outside and stood hidden behind a rose bush, watching Charlotte and Ethan play tag on the green lawn. Charlotte slowed down on purpose so Ethan could catch her. Then she tumbled onto the grass and let the boy climb on top of her, the two of them laughing uncontrollably beneath the golden afternoon sun. Ethan lay on Charlotte's chest and asked in an innocent voice if she loved him. Charlotte stroked his hair and said she loved him very much, more than all the stars in the sky added together. Ethan grinned and asked if that meant Charlotte would stay with him forever. Charlotte fell silent for a moment, then pulled him into her arms and whispered that she would stay with him as long as she possibly could. She promised. Maxwell stood there, hearing every word, and felt his throat tighten. He thought of Melissa, thought of the days when she was still alive, and this house was filled with laughter and warmth. He had believed those days would never return. He had accepted a life of darkness and cold until the end of his days. But Charlotte had brought the light back, not only for Ethan, but for him as well. He found himself looking forward to coming home, found himself smiling without realizing it when he heard her laughter from afar, found himself wanting to know more about the girl with calloused hands and a gentle heart. He didn't know what to call this feeling, or perhaps he did but didn't dare admit it. He only knew that as he watched Charlotte hold his son in the fading afternoon light that day, he saw a picture of family he thought had been lost forever, slowly being painted again in the warmest colors imaginable. Victoria knew she couldn't wait any longer. With each passing day, Charlotte became more important inside this house, and Victoria's position was being threatened more seriously than ever. She had witnessed the way Maxwell looked at Charlotte in the garden the previous afternoon. That look wasn't the gaze of an employer toward a hired hand. It was the look of a man falling into love, even if he hadn't yet realized it himself. Victoria understood that if she didn't act now, everything she had built over 5 years would collapse into nothing. That night, after the entire mansion had fallen asleep, Victoria slipped into Maxwell's bedroom. She knew the master was out handling business and wouldn't return until morning. Her hands trembled as she opened the vanity drawer where the gold-plated Rolex Melissa had given Maxwell on their wedding day was kept. That watch was the most sacred keepsake Maxwell still had of his wife. He never wore it for fear of damaging it, yet he never allowed it out of his sight. Victoria lifted the watch and studied it in the moonlight filtering through the window. This was the perfect weapon to destroy Charlotte. She slipped the watch into her pocket and left the room like a shadow. Charlotte's room was at the end of the second-floor hallway, its door unlocked because no one in this mansion had the habit of locking doors. Victoria pushed it open and entered silently. Charlotte was sleeping deeply on the bed, her face peaceful, her breathing steady. Victoria looked at the girl with hatred in her eyes, then rummaged through the wardrobe. She found the coat Charlotte often wore and slipped the Rolex into its inner pocket. When she was done, Victoria slipped out and returned to her own room with a triumphant smile. The next morning, Victoria knocked on Maxwell's office door the moment he returned home. Her face was filled with worry and unease, a flawless performance she'd rehearsed all night. "Mr. Thornton," she said in a trembling voice, "there's something important I need to report. Mrs. Melissa's watch, the one you keep in the vanity drawer. It's gone." Maxwell sprang to his feet, his eyes darkening instantly. "What?" he demanded in an icy voice. "What did you say?" Victoria swallowed and continued her act. "This morning I went in to clean as usual and noticed the drawer slightly open. I checked and the watch wasn't there. I asked all the staff and no one knows anything. I think we need to search." Maxwell strode out of his office, his face hard as stone. That watch was Melissa's last keepsake, the only thing he had left to remember his wife by. Whoever dared touch it would pay with their life. He ordered Raymond to gather all the staff in the mansion and begin searching every room. Victoria followed behind, watching with feigned concern. She knew exactly where the watch was and waited for the moment Charlotte would be exposed. The search began in the servants' rooms in the basement and slowly moved upward. Charlotte stood beside Ethan in the boys' room, not understanding what was happening. She only knew the master was furious and the entire mansion was tense. When the search reached Charlotte's room, she stepped aside calmly and let them work, certain she had nothing to hide. But when Raymond opened her wardrobe and checked the pockets of her coat, everything collapsed. Raymond pulled out the gleaming gold-plated Rolex and handed it to Maxwell, disbelief written across his face. "Sir," Raymond said, his voice catching. "It's here." Charlotte felt the blood freeze in her veins. She stared at the watch in Maxwell's hand, then down at her coat, unable to understand how it had ended up there. "No," she cried, her voice shaking. "No, I didn't take it. I swear I didn't touch it. I don't know why it's there. Someone set me up. Please believe me." Maxwell looked at Charlotte with eyes as cold as ice, all the warmth of the past days gone. He held the watch in his hand, the final memory of his wife, the thing he valued more than anything in the world, and it had been found in the pocket of the woman he had trusted, the woman he had opened his heart to, without ever admitting it. Victoria stood behind the crowd with a carefully hidden half-smile. She watched Charlotte fall to her knees, begging, tears streaming down her face, and felt a deep, intoxicating satisfaction. The plan had worked. The girl from the south side was about to be cast out, and Victoria's position in this house would be stronger than ever. Maxwell stood there, looking at Charlotte with an expression she'd never seen before, an icy gaze that cut straight to the bone, filled with betrayal and rage. The Rolex watch in his hand trembled with each heavy breath he took. "You took this," Maxwell said, his voice low and slow like distant thunder rolling across the sky. "You took my wife's keepsake, the only thing I have left of her. You dared to take it." Charlotte knelt on the floor, tears pouring down her face, lifting her head to look at Maxwell with utter despair in her eyes. "I didn't take it," she sobbed. "I swear to you. I swear on my mother's life. I never touched anything that belongs to you. Someone set me up. Please believe me. Please give me a chance to explain." Maxwell stepped back, as if being close to Charlotte made his skin crawl. He remembered how he'd opened his heart to her, how he'd trusted her with his son, how he'd begun to feel emotions he thought had died long ago, and now it all seemed like a lie, a scheme by a girl from the South Side slums to profit from his wealth. He felt foolish. He felt betrayed. And that pain turned into a fury he could no longer control. "Get out of my house," Maxwell roared. "Immediately. I don't want to see your face for another second. Raymond, take her out and make sure she never sets foot here again." Charlotte tried to stand, but her legs had no strength left. "Please," she begged, "at least let me say goodbye to Ethan. He won't understand. He'll be heartbroken." "Don't you dare say my son's name," Maxwell shouted, his voice echoing through the hallway. "You have no right to speak it. You used him to get close to me, to steal from me. And now what else do you want? Get out." Raymond stepped forward and grabbed Charlotte by the arm, pulling her to her feet. There was something uneasy in his eyes, as if he too doubted the truth of this story, but he didn't dare disobey his employer. Victoria stood nearby with a face of feigned sorrow, while her eyes gleamed with victory. Charlotte was dragged down the hallway, past the expensive paintings she'd admired every day, past the staircase where she'd once sung lullabies for Ethan, past the grand hall where she dared to dream of a better life. She struggled, tried to turn back to look at Ethan's room one last time, but Raymond held her tightly. Outside, rain had begun to fall, the first drops of an approaching storm. Wind screamed through the garden trees, sounding like anguished cries. Charlotte was shoved out the front door and fell hard onto the freezing stone steps. She lifted her head and watched the mansion doors slam shut before her, feeling as though the entire world was collapsing. The rain came down in sheets, soaking Charlotte to the bone within seconds. She had no umbrella, no coat, no money, nothing but the clothes on her back. She slipped her hand into her pocket and touched something familiar, the yellow rubber gloves she carried out of habit. Charlotte clutched the gloves to her chest and broke down, sobbing in the storm. Those gloves were the only thing left of her brief happiness, of Ethan's laughter, of the warmth Maxwell had once shown her. Now, it was all gone, stolen by a scheme she'd never seen coming. Charlotte staggered toward the gate through the rain and wind, her body shaking from cold and pain. She turned back one last time toward the Thornton mansion and saw a small figure standing at a second-floor window. Ethan. The boy stood there with his face pressed to the glass, wide eyes staring down at her in confused fear, not understanding what was happening. Charlotte wanted to scream, to wave goodbye, to tell him she was sorry, that she loved him, that none of this was his fault, but she couldn't, because a hand pulled the curtain closed, and Ethan's figure vanished. Charlotte collapsed onto the road, letting the rain lash her body, letting the wind howl in her ears, and cried until she had no tears left. She didn't know where to go. She had no home to return to, because her South Side apartment had been taken back when she moved here. Her mother lay in a hospital bed, and now Charlotte didn't know who would pay the bills. Everything had fallen apart completely, and Charlotte was left alone in the Chicago storm, clutching a pair of soaked yellow gloves in her hands. The morning after the storm had passed, Ethan woke up, and the very first thing he did was run to Charlotte's room like he did every day. He pushed the door open and froze when he saw the room standing empty. The bed neatly made, the wardrobe wide open with not a single item left inside. Ethan stood there for a moment, his wide eyes scanning the space as if searching for an answer to this strange disappearance. "Charlotte," he called softly. "Where is Charlotte?" There was no reply. Ethan ran into the hallway and began opening doors one by one, from the bathroom to the storage room, from the staircase to the grand hall. "Charlotte," he called louder, his voice beginning to tremble. "Charlotte, stop hiding. Ethan is scared." Still no answer came. The boy ran down to the first floor, rushed through the kitchen, burst into the back garden, calling Charlotte's name without stopping. The servants watched him with pity in their eyes, but no one dared to speak, as Victoria had instructed them not to mention Charlotte's name in front of the child. Ethan ran back inside, his small legs stumbling again and again, tears beginning to spill uncontrollably. "Where is Charlotte?" he cried and screamed. "Why isn't Charlotte here? Charlotte promised to stay with Ethan." Charlotte promised. Victoria appeared at the top of the stairs with a cold expression. She had prepared herself for this moment and rehearsed a perfect script to explain Charlotte's disappearance. "Charlotte has left," Victoria said calmly. "She was a bad person. She stole Papa's things and was thrown out. She doesn't love Ethan. She was only pretending." Ethan stood at the foot of the stairs, looking up at Victoria with eyes full of confusion and fear. "No." The boy shook his head violently. "Charlotte isn't bad. Charlotte loves Ethan. Charlotte promised to stay with Ethan forever." "You're lying! You're lying!" Then the boy began to scream and sob, his cries echoing through the mansion like the wail of a wounded animal. "Charlotte!" Ethan screamed. "Charlotte, come back! Ethan wants Charlotte." "Charlotte." Victoria felt a headache pounding from the piercing cries. She walked down the stairs, forcing herself to suppress the irritation rising inside her. "Stop it," she said coldly to Ethan. "Charlotte is gone and she's never coming back. Accept it." But Ethan didn't listen. He cried even louder, screamed even harder. He threw himself onto the floor, kicking and pounding, calling Charlotte's name again and again as if sheer repetition could make her appear. Victoria felt her patience snap. She had endured this child for 2 years, pretending to care while in truth she despised his existence. Now that Charlotte was gone, she thought everything would return to normal. Yet the boy was screaming like this. "I told you to stop it," Victoria shouted, and grabbed Ethan's arm, yanking him to his feet. "Listen here. Charlotte is a thief. She's bad. She doesn't deserve for you to cry like this. Stop it now." Ethan struggled and bit Victoria's hand, making her scream in pain. In a burst of uncontrolled rage, Victoria swung her hand and slapped the boy across the face. The sound of the slap cracked through the grand hall. Ethan fell to the floor, his cheek flushed red with the clear imprint of 5 fingers, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He lay there, no longer crying, no longer screaming, just staring at Victoria with the same hollow, lifeless gaze he'd had 2 years earlier when he witnessed his mother being shot to death. Victoria suddenly realized what she had done. She looked down at her hand, then at the child lying on the floor, and a flash of fear crossed her eyes. If Maxwell found out about this, she'd be dead. She dropped to her knees and tried to pull Ethan up, her voice suddenly turning falsely sweet. "Ethan, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. Don't tell Papa, okay? I'll buy you toys. I promise." But Ethan didn't react. He let Victoria pull him to his feet, his eyes empty, staring into nothing, his lips pressed tightly together without a word. He had retreated back into the silent cocoon Charlotte had worked so hard to draw him out of, and this time, it seemed no one could reach him anymore. Maxwell returned to the mansion that afternoon after a long day handling business, yet his mind couldn't focus on anything at all. The image of Charlotte kneeling at his feet, tears streaming down her face as she swore she was innocent, haunted him relentlessly. Something was wrong. A small voice in his head kept repeating that thought all through the night and into the day. Charlotte wasn't that kind of person. She'd had countless chances to take anything from this house, yet she never had. She only cared about Ethan and never asked for anything for herself. When Maxwell stepped into the main hall, the first thing he noticed was the terrifying silence that had settled over the mansion. There was no sound of Ethan's laughter, no small footsteps racing through the corridors, no excited Papa greeting him when he came home. Raymond was waiting, his face tense and his eyes filled with worry. "Sir," Raymond said in a low voice, "something happened to the boy. You should check the security cameras." Maxwell felt his heart tighten. He moved quickly to the security room where the surveillance system monitored the entire estate. Raymond had prepared the footage and began playing it from the beginning. The first clip showed Victoria sneaking into Maxwell's bedroom at 2 a.m. the night before. She opened the drawer, took out the Rolex watch, and slipped it into her pocket. Maxwell felt his blood boil as he watched, his hands clenching into fists so hard his nails dug into his skin. The next clip showed Victoria sneaking into Charlotte's room while the girl slept soundly, rummaging through the wardrobe and slipping the watch into the pocket of Charlotte's coat. Victoria's face, caught clearly in the dim light, wore a triumphant, sickening smile. Maxwell shot to his feet, his eyes blazing with rage. He'd thrown an innocent woman out into the storm. He hadn't believed her pleas. He'd allowed the real enemy to live under his roof for years without realizing it. "There's more, sir," Raymond said, switching to the next clip. "This is from this morning." Maxwell stared at the screen and saw Ethan screaming Charlotte's name, saw Victoria grabbing the boy's arm and shouting, then saw the slap that sent Ethan crashing to the floor. He saw his son lying there with that hollow, empty expression, the same one from 2 years ago, and the fury inside him erupted like a volcano. Maxwell stormed out of the security room, his footsteps thundering like rolling thunder. He went straight to Victoria's room and kicked the door open without knocking. Victoria was sitting at her vanity, and when she saw him, she jumped up with her familiar sweet smile. "Mr. Thornton," she began, but her words were cut short when Maxwell grabbed her by the throat and slammed her against the wall. "You dare," Maxwell roared, his voice like a snarling beast. "You dare frame Charlotte. You dare lay a hand on my son. Who do you think you are?" Victoria was so terrified her face went white. She struggled uselessly as Maxwell's grip tightened like an iron vice around her neck. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I just wanted to protect you. That girl is a con artist. I only wanted to expose her." "Shut up," Maxwell shouted, throwing Victoria to the floor like a bag of trash. "You're the con artist. You've lived in this house for 5 years and lied to me for 5 years. You think I don't know what you wanted. You wanted to replace Melissa. You wanted to become the lady of this house. But you never will. Never." Victoria lay on the floor, tears streaming down her face as she crawled toward Maxwell and clutched at his legs. "Please forgive me," she cried. "I worked for you for 5 years. I gave everything to this house. Please don't throw me out. I'll fix it, I promise." Maxwell kicked her away and looked down at her with pure contempt. "Get out of my house," he said coldly. "Right now. You take nothing with you. No clothes, no money, nothing. You came here with empty hands, and you'll leave with empty hands. And if I ever hear that you've opened your mouth about this family to anyone, I swear I'll make you disappear from this earth without a trace." Raymond appeared at the doorway and dragged Victoria to her feet. She was hauled down the hallway, down the stairs, out the front door, and thrown into the street the same way Charlotte had been treated the night before. The mansion doors slammed shut behind her, ending 5 years of schemes and ambition in a single afternoon. Maxwell stood in the hall, his breathing still heavy with fury, but now only one thought filled his mind. Charlotte. He had to find her. He had to apologize. He had to bring her back before it was too late. Maxwell grabbed his car keys and stormed out of the mansion without saying a word to anyone. Raymond tried to run after him and offered to come along, but Maxwell waved him off sharply. He didn't have time to wait. Every second that passed was another second Charlotte was out there alone, suffering. He jumped into the black Maybach and slammed on the gas, the tires screaming against the pavement as the car shot forward like a bullet tearing through the night. Outside, rain began to fall again, the second storm in 2 consecutive days, rolling toward Chicago as if the sky itself wanted to test him. Rain lashed against the windshield like thousands of tiny bullets. The wipers were running at full speed and still couldn't clear his view, but Maxwell didn't slow down. He drove like a madman, running red lights, weaving through traffic, heading straight for the South Side, the most dangerous part of Chicago, a place even the police avoided after dark. Raymond had texted him the address of Charlotte's old apartment, and according to the investigation, she might have gone back there because she had nowhere else to go. Maxwell prayed she was still there, that she was safe, that he wasn't too late to fix his mistake. The Maybach turned onto a dark street leading into the South Side when Maxwell sensed something was wrong. A black truck suddenly burst out of a nearby alley and blocked the road, forcing him to slam on the brakes. Before he could react, 2 more vehicles appeared from behind and from the side, completely surrounding him. The truck doors flew open, and 4 men dressed in black stepped out, guns raised and aimed straight at the Maybach. Maxwell recognized them instantly. They were Anthony Ricci's men, the sworn enemy who'd murdered his wife 2 years earlier. Ricci must have had his people watching the mansion and spotted Maxwell leaving alone tonight. A perfect chance for revenge. "Maxwell Thornton," one of them shouted through the rain. "Boss Ricci sends his regards. Tonight you'll see your wife again in hell." Maxwell didn't reply. He pulled the gun hidden beneath the driver's seat and kicked the car door open, rolling out just as a hail of bullets shattered the windshield where he'd been sitting moments before. He took cover behind the car and returned fire, every shot precise and lethal. the way he'd been trained through years in the underworld. One man dropped, then another. But the remaining attackers kept firing relentlessly. A searing pain tore through Maxwell's left shoulder as a bullet punched through flesh, blood spilling down his arm. He clenched his teeth and kept shooting, taking down another man. The last one panicked and tried to run back to the truck, but Maxwell didn't give him the chance. A shot to the leg sent him crashing face first onto the wet asphalt. Maxwell walked over, blood dripping from his shoulder onto the rain-soaked road, and looked down at the man groaning at his feet. "Tell Ricci," Maxwell said coldly, "that I'm coming for him, and when I find him, he'll beg to die." He left the man there and returned to the Maybach, its windows shattered by gunfire. He tried the engine, and by sheer luck, it still started. Maxwell pressed the accelerator and drove on through the rain, one hand gripping the steering wheel, the other pressed tightly against the wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. His head began to spin from blood loss, but he refused to pass out. Not now, not when Charlotte was still out there waiting. 20 minutes later, the Maybach stopped in front of a crumbling apartment building in the south side. Maxwell got out and staggered toward the stairwell, blood dripping onto each step as he climbed to the 5th floor. The hallway was pitch black with no electricity, the stench of dampness and urine hitting his nose. But he didn't care. He found apartment number 507 and knocked. No answer. He knocked harder and called out, "Charlotte, I know you're in there. Please open the door." Still silence. Maxwell stepped back and kicked the rotten wooden door open. He walked into the dark apartment and saw a sight that crushed his heart. Charlotte was sitting beside the old bed, where her mother lay, barely breathing, the yellow rubber gloves still soaked and clutched in her hands, her face pale with exhaustion and despair. She looked up at the noise, and her eyes widened in shock when she saw Maxwell standing there, clothes soaked in blood, his face drained from blood loss, yet his eyes fixed on her with something she couldn't put into words. Charlotte stepped back as Maxwell staggered into the apartment, every instinct screaming at her to run, to get away from the man who had thrown her into the storm without listening to a single word she'd said. But when she saw the blood pouring from his shoulder and dripping onto the filthy floor, she froze. "You're hurt," Charlotte blurted out, her voice shaking, asking what happened and who had done this to him, but Maxwell didn't answer. He looked around the squalid apartment with its mold-covered walls, leaking ceiling, no electricity, no heat, and then at the frail woman barely breathing on the battered old bed, Dorothy Hayes, Charlotte's mother, fighting terminal cancer and looking as though she might slip away at any moment. Maxwell felt his heart break apart because he'd thrown Charlotte into the storm and forced her back into this hell, while he sat in luxury trusting a traitor, realizing he'd made the greatest mistake of his life. He stepped toward Charlotte, and she retreated, fear and hurt filling her eyes as she asked why he was here, and what else he wanted after taking her job, her money, and Ethan. And then Maxwell stopped and did the unthinkable. He knelt. The most powerful mafia boss in Chicago dropped to his knees in front of a cleaning woman in a crumbling South Side apartment and apologized, admitting he'd checked the cameras, seen Victoria steal the watch and frame her, admitting she was innocent and always had been, admitting he'd hurt her in a way that couldn't be forgiven. Charlotte stared at him, stunned, emptied by days of tears, as the man who caused her suffering knelt bleeding before her, and her instincts overrode everything as she whispered about his shoulder needing bandaging. Maxwell told her he didn't matter, that she did, that her mother did, promising to fix everything as he called Raymond with his blood-slicked hand and ordered a medical helicopter, emergency transport to Northwestern Memorial. The best operating room prepared, all costs covered. Charlotte's knees gave out as she collapsed, crying, asking why he was doing this, after not believing her, and Maxwell crawled closer, taking her trembling hands and telling her it was because he was wrong, because she deserved better, because his son needed her and hadn't spoken since she left, retreating back into silence, and because he needed her too. Minutes later, the helicopter thundered over the south side, medical staff rushing Dorothy onto a stretcher as Charlotte clutched her mother's hand, sobbing in disbelief, while Maxwell stood beside her, pressing his bleeding shoulder and resting a steadying hand on her back. When the helicopter lifted off, Maxwell asked Charlotte to come home, telling her Ethan was waiting, that he was waiting, asking for a chance to make things right. And Charlotte looked at him, blood-soaked and pale, yet sincere and pleading, thought of Ethan's laughter and the way he called her name, and nodded. Maxwell lifted her with his uninjured arm, carried her down the foul, damp stairs and into the easing rain, settled her into the back seat of Raymond's waiting car, and let her lean against his shoulder all the way back to the mansion. And for the first time in 2 days of hell, Charlotte felt like she could breathe again. When the car stopped in front of the Thornton mansion, Charlotte saw a small figure standing at the front door, even though it was nearly midnight. Ethan stood there in pale blue pajamas, messy blonde hair sticking out in every direction, eyes swollen from crying yet wide open as he stared toward the approaching car. He hadn't slept for 2 nights, hadn't eaten a single bite, had only sat by the window waiting for a miracle, and the miracle had finally arrived. The moment Charlotte stepped out of the car, Ethan ran toward her like a tiny bullet, his short legs moving so fast he nearly tripped, crashing into her and wrapping his arms tightly around her legs, sobbing without making a sound. Charlotte dropped to her knees and pulled him into her arms, her own tears falling freely. "Ethan," she whispered against his ear, apologizing over and over for leaving without saying goodbye, telling him how much she'd missed him. Ethan lifted his tear-soaked face and said in a hoarse voice from crying too much that Charlotte mustn't go again, that he was scared, that he wanted her to stay with him forever, asking her to promise, and Charlotte held him tighter and promised she'd never leave him again. Maxwell stood nearby watching them, and felt warmth spread through his chest, an emotion he'd believed had died with Melissa, now slowly coming back to life. The days that followed became a time of healing for everyone in the Thornton mansion. Charlotte was moved into the most beautiful room on the 2nd floor beside Ethan's, no longer confined to the dark basement. Maxwell's shoulder wound was treated and began to heal. Dorothy underwent successful surgery at Northwestern Memorial and started recovering, then was moved into a private room at the mansion, so Charlotte could care for her while staying close to Ethan. Maxwell gathered the entire household and declared that from now on, Charlotte and her mother were members of the Thornton family, and anyone who treated them with disrespect would answer directly to him, and no one dared say a word. Ethan slowly returned to being the cheerful, lively child he'd been before Charlotte left, clinging to her from morning until night, refusing to let go as if afraid she might disappear again. Charlotte stayed patiently by his side, reading to him every night, teaching him to draw every afternoon, playing doctor with the yellow rubber gloves she kept as a keepsake. The feelings between Maxwell and Charlotte grew quietly over time like a small flame slowly fed with air, beginning with longer glances when they passed each other in the hallway, then brief touches of hands at the dinner table, then late-night conversations on the rooftop overlooking the glowing lights of Chicago. Maxwell told Charlotte about Melissa, about their love and the pain of losing her, about the 2 years of hell watching his son sink into silence. Charlotte told Maxwell about her abusive childhood, about hiding in closets to escape beatings, about her dream of becoming a teacher that she'd been forced to abandon. They shared the deepest wounds of their souls and found understanding where they least expected it. Maxwell began coming home earlier, spending more time with Ethan and Charlotte instead of drowning himself in work, and discovered that Charlotte was not only gentle but intelligent and strong, with a view of life he'd never known from his ivory tower. Charlotte discovered that behind the cold and frightening exterior of the Mafia boss was a lonely man longing to be loved, a devoted father willing to do anything to protect those he cared about. They didn't say it aloud, but they both knew something was changing between them, an invisible thread pulling them closer each day, and neither of them wanted to cut that thread. 3 months had passed since the night Maxwell knelt and begged for forgiveness in a slum apartment on the South Side. 3 rare months of peace in the turbulent life of the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago. But in the underworld, peace was only the silence before the storm. And Anthony Ricci never forgot his blood feud with the Thornton family. He had watched Maxwell from a distance for months, knew about the failed ambush when 4 of his gunmen were taken down, knew Maxwell had brought a woman back to the mansion and was living like a happy family, and he realized this was the enemy's fatal weakness. Maxwell Thornton might be a man without fear, but everyone had an Achilles heel, and Maxwell's heel was the cleaning woman and the son Ricci hadn't managed to kill 2 years earlier. That afternoon, Charlotte took Ethan to a toy store downtown after the boy begged her for a week to buy a new Lego set, and she couldn't refuse those sparkling eyes. They were accompanied by 2 bodyguards Maxwell had assigned, large men in black suits who kept a few meters' distance and scanned their surroundings, and Charlotte felt safe, unaware they'd been followed from the moment they left the mansion. When they stepped out of the store carrying the toy bag, everything happened too fast for Charlotte to react. A black van jumped the curb, and 4 masked men leapt out. The bodyguards barely had time to draw their guns before they were shot down by gunfire from the vehicle. Charlotte screamed and clutched Ethan, trying to run, but a rough hand yanked her hair and dragged her back. She was thrown into the back of the van along with Ethan, who was screaming in terror. The doors slammed shut, and the van sped away, leaving 2 dead bodyguards on the sidewalk amid the panicked screams of passers-by. Charlotte held Ethan tightly in the darkness of the van, trying to soothe him even as her heart raced with fear, whispering that he shouldn't be afraid, that Charlotte was here and would protect him. Ethan trembled in her arms, eyes wide as he stared at the masked men sitting around them with guns in hand. Memories flooding back of the night 2 years earlier. The gunshots and his mother's blood, the nightmare repeating itself. Except this time Charlotte was there, and he clung to her like a lifeline in a black sea. After about half an hour, the van stopped, and they were dragged into an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago. Charlotte was shoved onto the freezing concrete floor, and Ethan was ripped from her arms. She screamed and lunged for him, but a kick to her stomach doubled her over in pain. A man stepped out of the shadows without a mask, and Charlotte saw an aged face with eyes as cold as a snake's. Anthony Ricci looked down at her with a triumphant smile and said, "This must be the bitch Maxwell Thornton treasured so much," then glanced at Ethan, shaking in fear, and said he'd planned to kill the boy along with his mother 2 years ago, but his useless men let him live, and today he'd finish the job. Charlotte felt her blood turn to ice. She looked at Ethan being grabbed by the collar, his eyes full of terror and despair, and knew what she had to do. She lunged toward him despite the pain tearing through her body, shoved the man aside, and wrapped herself around the boy, shielding him with her own body like a living barrier. She screamed that if they wanted to kill him, they'd have to kill her first, that she wouldn't let them touch him, that they'd have to step over her dead body. Ricci watched with amusement and ordered his men to beat her until she let the boy go. Charlotte was brutally beaten, fists and boots crashing into her back and shoulders, but she didn't release Ethan. She held him tight and covered his head with her arms, letting every blow land on her instead of him. Blood ran from her mouth and forehead, yet she didn't cry out, only whispered into Ethan's ear not to be afraid, that Papa would come and save them, that Charlotte promised. Ethan sobbed silently in her arms, feeling every blow strike her body while she never let go, holding him as if he were her entire world. And in that moment, Ethan knew that Charlotte truly loved him enough to die for him. Maxwell was sitting in his study reviewing business reports when Raymond burst in without knocking, his face pale as death. "Sir," Raymond said in a trembling voice, "Charlotte and the boy have been kidnapped. The 2 bodyguards are dead. Ricci's men." Maxwell shot to his feet and swept every document off the desk in one violent motion. For a split second, it felt as if his heart had stopped beating. Not again. Not Charlotte and Ethan. He couldn't lose them the way he'd lost Melissa. Rage erupted inside him like a volcanic explosion, incinerating all rational thought and leaving only a single, burning desire to kill Anthony Ricci with his own hands. "Call everyone!" Maxwell roared in a voice Raymond had never heard in 20 years of service. "Everyone. I want every gunman we have assembled within 30 minutes. Find Ricci at any cost. Whoever brings me his location gets $1 million. Anyone who stands in the way dies." Maxwell Thornton's underworld empire sprang into motion like a massive war machine. Dozens of gunmen were summoned from across Chicago. Informants were paid 10 times their usual rate to track Ricci's movements, and contacts within the police and city government were activated to seal off every possible exit from the city. Within 2 hours, Maxwell had pinpointed the warehouse where Charlotte and Ethan were being held, thanks to a snitch inside Ricci's own crew. A convoy of black vehicles tore through the night like a pack of hunting wolves. Maxwell sat in the front seat with a loaded gun in his hand, his eyes cold and fearless. He'd killed before, many times, but he'd never craved blood the way he did tonight. Ricci had touched what mattered most to him, and he would pay in blood. When the convoy reached the warehouse, the assault began instantly. Gunfire thundered through the darkness, muzzle flashes bursting like hellish fireworks. Maxwell's men outnumbered Ricci's 3-1 and were far better equipped, surging into the warehouse like an unstoppable tidal wave. Ricci's soldiers fell one by one, screams and gunshots echoing everywhere. Maxwell led from the front, not hiding behind others like most bosses, but charging straight into the fight. Every bullet he fired carried the fury of a man defending his family. He dropped 5 men in under 2 minutes, stepping over their bodies without a glance. When the final door was kicked open, Maxwell saw a sight that tore his heart apart. Charlotte lay on the freezing concrete floor, her clothes soaked with blood, her face bruised and swollen from the beating, yet her arms were still wrapped tightly around Ethan, refusing to let go. She'd used her own body as a shield to protect his son, taking every blow so Ethan wouldn't be hurt. Anthony Ricci stood in the corner with a gun pressed to Charlotte's head, the last man standing in the room. "Don't come any closer," Ricci screamed, his voice shaking with fear. "I'll kill this bitch. I swear I'll blow her head off." Maxwell stopped, his eyes locking onto Ricci's with pure, murderous hatred. "Go ahead," Maxwell said in a voice of ice. Shoot her, and then you'll find out exactly what I'll do to you. Ricci saw death in Maxwell's eyes and his hand began to tremble. He knew he'd lost. Knew that even if he killed Charlotte, he wouldn't leave this place alive. In that moment of hesitation, Maxwell lunged forward and knocked the gun from Ricci's hand. Ricci crashed to the floor, and Maxwell jumped on him, raining blow after blow onto his face with all the rage he'd been holding back. Blood sprayed from Ricci's nose and mouth, but Maxwell didn't stop. Not until Ricci's face was completely ruined. Then he drew his gun and aimed it straight at Ricci's head. You killed my wife, Maxwell whispered, his voice shaking with hatred. You stole my son's voice for 2 years, and tonight you dared to touch Charlotte and Ethan. You're going to die, Ricci, by my hand. Don't. Charlotte's weak voice came from behind him. Maxwell turned and saw her struggling to push herself up. One arm still wrapped around Ethan, the other braced against the floor. Her face was covered in blood and bruises, but her eyes pleaded with him. Don't kill him, Charlotte said hoarsely. Don't dirty your hands for him. Don't let Ethan see you kill someone. He's already watched his mother die. Don't make him witness another death. Maxwell looked at his son trembling in Charlotte's arms. Ethan's wide eyes filled with fear as they stared at him. And in that moment he knew she was right. He couldn't kill Ricci in front of Ethan. He couldn't let his son see him as a murderer, no matter how much Ricci deserved to die. Maxwell lowered his gun and stood up, walking toward Charlotte and Ethan. Call the feds, he ordered Raymond, who was standing in the doorway. Hand Ricci over to them with all the evidence of his crimes. Let him rot in prison until he dies. That's a punishment far worse than a bullet. Maxwell knelt beside Charlotte and gently pulled her and Ethan into his arms. I'm sorry, he whispered against her ear. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. Charlotte smiled through bloodied lips and tightened her grip on Maxwell's hand. You came, she said softly. You came, and that's all that matters. 2 months after the kidnapping, the wounds on Charlotte's body had healed, but the scars in her soul would remain forever as a reminder of that horrifying night. Anthony Ricci had been sentenced to life in prison without parole on countless charges ranging from murder to drug trafficking, and he would rot in a federal prison until the day he died. Thornton Manor had finally found true peace, with no shadows of the past and no enemies lurking in the dark, only laughter and the warmth of a family slowly taking shape. Today was Ethan's 4th birthday, and Maxwell decided to hold a small celebration with only those closest to them. There were no extravagant guests from high society, no fake faces or polite smiles, just Maxwell, Charlotte, Dorothy, who had almost fully recovered after her surgery, and Raymond, who had become an inseparable part of the family. The living room was decorated with colorful balloons and a birthday banner Charlotte had made by hand. A teddy bear-shaped cake sat on the table with 4 candles glowing softly. Ethan sat in front of the cake with eyes shining with happiness, wearing a pointed birthday hat and grinning nonstop as everyone sang the birthday song. Blow out the candles, son, Maxwell said, resting a hand on his boy's shoulder. Remember to make a wish before you do. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, his lips moving as if whispering his wish to himself. Then he took a deep breath and blew out all 4 candles at once. Everyone applauded, and Charlotte leaned down to kiss his forehead. What did you wish for, Ethan? Dorothy asked gently with a warm smile. Ethan opened his eyes and looked around the table with a seriousness that was almost funny. He looked at Maxwell, then at Charlotte, then back at Maxwell, as if deciding whether he should say it out loud. Finally, he announced in his clear voice that echoed through the room, I wish Papa would kiss Charlotte. Silence filled the room for a few seconds. Dorothy giggled and stood up, saying she needed to get more ice cream, and Raymond quickly followed, making an excuse to help her. They disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Maxwell and Charlotte sitting across from each other, their faces flushed like 2 children caught doing something mischievous. Ethan sat between them, looking back and forth with hopeful eyes. Kids always tell the truth, he added proudly, as if defending his wish. Charlotte was about to speak, but Maxwell looked at her and felt his heart race like never before. He'd loved her for a long time now, maybe since the day he'd seen her lying in his bed with the yellow gloves and heard his son call Papa for the first time in 2 silent years. He'd loved her through every day watching her care for Ethan, through every late-night conversation on the rooftop, and through the terrifying moments when he thought he might lose her forever. But he'd never dared to say it, afraid of scaring her, afraid she'd think he was abusing his power. Maxwell stood up and walked around the table to stand in front of Charlotte. He took her hand and gently pulled her to her feet, his eyes locked onto hers with all the sincerity and love he'd kept hidden for so long. I know we come from 2 different worlds, Maxwell began in a low, steady voice, I know I'm a monster in many people's eyes, and I know you deserve better than a man like me, but I can't stop loving you, Charlotte. You and your yellow gloves saved my son, saved me too. You brought light back into this house, and warmth back into my heart. I love you, and I want you by my side, not as Ethan's caregiver, but as the woman of my life. Charlotte looked at him with tears filling her eyes. She'd loved him for a long time, but had never dared to admit it, believing she wasn't worthy. That a girl from the South Side slums could never stand beside the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago. But now, hearing his words and looking into his eyes, seeing the truth of his love, she wasn't afraid anymore. I love you too, Charlotte whispered. Maxwell smiled, the brightest smile he'd worn in years, then leaned down and kissed her. Their first kiss wasn't fiery or dramatic like in a Hollywood movie. It was gentle and warm, the kiss of two lonely souls who had finally found each other. Ethan clapped his hands and cheered from his chair. His birthday wish had come true. 1 year later, golden afternoon sunlight poured through the windows of the master bedroom at Thornton Manor, a room that had once been as cold as a tomb but was now filled with warmth and laughter. On the oak bedside table, a crystal frame rested in a place of honor, and inside it was not a photograph or an expensive piece of jewelry, but a pair of worn yellow rubber gloves, aged by time. Beneath the frame was a small gold-plated plaque with delicately engraved words, "The hands that saved us." It was the most sacred keepsake of the Thornton family, more precious than the $1 million paintings on the walls or the priceless antiques locked behind glass. Charlotte lay on the large bed, her dark hair spread across the pillow, her face glowing in a simple white dress. She was no longer the janitor from the South Side slums. She was now the lady of this manor, the wife of Maxwell Thornton. But more than anything, she was the happiest woman in the world. Ethan, now 5 years old, taller and stronger than the frail little boy who had once curled up silently in a dark corner 3 years earlier, bounced around her and attacked her with tickles. Charlotte laughed until she nearly collapsed and pretended to plead for help. "Save me. I'm under attack." Maxwell walked into the room, no longer wearing the stiff black suit he used to wear for work, just a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves and comfortable khaki pants. He looked younger, more at peace, as if the weight of so many years in the underworld had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He jumped onto the bed and joined the tickling battle, the three of them rolling across the silk sheets without caring if they wrinkled or got dirty. When the laughter finally faded, they lay still, staring up at the ceiling, Ethan in the middle, with one hand holding Charlotte's and the other holding Maxwell's. "Papa," Ethan suddenly spoke, "are we rich?" Maxwell turned to look at his wife, at her slightly rounded belly where a new life was growing day by day, at the happiness shining in her eyes, and he smiled before answering his son with a voice full of love. "Yes, son, we're very rich. We're the richest people in the world. But not because of money in the bank or the buildings Papa owns. We're rich because we have something money can never buy. Love, family, people who are willing to sacrifice everything for each other." Ethan nodded, as if he understood something profound, even though he was only 5. Then he hugged Charlotte tightly and whispered, "I love you, Mom Charlotte." Charlotte held him close and cried tears of happiness. It was the first time Ethan had ever called her Mom. Maxwell stood frozen, the word Mom vibrating in the air like a sacred miracle that finally completed their broken world. He looked at the framed yellow gloves across the room and realized that those humble hands had bought him a treasure his millions never could. Before he moved to pull both Charlotte and Ethan into a fierce, trembling embrace, his heart finally finding the peace that had been buried since the night he lost Melissa. Outside the window, Dorothy sat in the garden reading under the afternoon sun, fully recovered from her surgery and now living with her daughter's family in the manor. Raymond stood nearby, watching over her with a gentle smile. Everyone had found their place after so many storms, and somewhere in that warm room, the yellow rubber gloves inside the crystal frame seemed to be smiling, bearing witness to the miracle created by ordinary hands.